Hey friends. Tonight, we're drifting back, not to the golden age of piracy, but to something older, quieter, and perhaps a little more uncertain. To a time when the salt clung heavier, the sails sagged lower, and the only difference between a pirate and a patriot was a slip of parchment and a tired nod from a distant crown. These were the privateers of the medieval seas. Men with calloused hands and creased letters of marque, warriors whose loyalty swayed with the wind, and whose ships carried both the blessing of their monarchs and the stains of choices best not revisited. There were no parrots.no treasure maps. Only damp wood, creaking decks, and the slow, deliberate violence of men who called it duty. Welcome to Sleepful History. If you enjoy these drifting explorations, feel free to like the video, but only if it truly helps you rest. Let me know where you're listening from, and what time sleep found you tonight. Now, take a deep breath. Let the weight of your blankets become the heaviness of a sea cloak. Let the distant hum of night become the wind through old rigging. And picture this: a lonely ship, low in the water, sails patched and full, moving like it remembers something it won't say aloud. Below deck, a crew of quiet men waits, not to plunder, not exactly, but to act. With permission. With ink. And with just enough silence to make you wonder what that permission really meant. Tonight, we sail with medieval privateers, and their story, weary and weathered, is just beginning. Chapter 1: The Sound of Damp Timber. The village didn't have a name worth remembering, not because it had never been named, but because no one beyond its soggy fields and salt-bitten piers ever bothered to recall it. It was tucked into a wind-scoured nook on a forgotten edge of the kingdom, where maps smudged, borders blurred, and the land smelled permanently of damp straw, fish guts, and smoke. The houses were modest, though that word is often too kind. Walls leaned apologetically in multiple directions, held together by a democracy of wet mud, warped timber, and the miracle of shared resignation. Roofs, thatched and sagging, moaned softly when the wind pushed in from the sea, like old men sighing in their sleep. Inside, the air was perpetually tinged with the scent of wet wool, stale turnip broth, and the slow rot of furniture that had once dreamed of being boats. Children, barefoot and scab-kneed, ran between the cottages, trailing laughter that turned to coughing in the morning chill. Their clothes were patchworks of older garments long buried by better families, passed down like folktales and lice. A cloak might have once belonged to a shepherd, or a drunk, or both. Now it belonged to someone smaller and colder, who wore it because there were no other options. Everyone wore what they had and hoped the goats didn't miss it. The docks were the center of the village, though center suggested more structure than reality allowed. A jagged lattice of planks extended into the gray water, groaning beneath the weight of its own age. Salt crusted its nails like barnacles on old bone. Nets hung like ghosts drying in the wind, stiff with salt and fish oil, perfumed with a tang that crawled into the sinuses and took up residence. The sea, for its part, was always there, slapping at the pilings with the patience of eternity, waiting to take something away. No one in the village spoke of the sea with poetry. It wasn't adventure or destiny, it was labor. A hard, splintering sort of survival that demanded fingers, warmth, and occasionally entire suns. Boats went out. Sometimes they returned. There were names, of course, vessels with peeling paint that declared themselves Martha's Mercy or St. Egren's Tooth, names that suggested optimism or penance. But even the youngest boys knew better. You didn't name a boat because it was noble. You named it so it could be remembered if it sank. Inside one such house, darker than the others because its window had given up last winter, an old man sat on a stool so worn it had the shape of him etched into it. His breath fogged the air, and each exhale smelled faintly of boiled onions and regret. His fingers, curled like old roots, tugged at a scrap of rope out of habit more than purpose. Behind him, the fire clung to its last embers, casting a flickering glow across the dirt-packed floor. The warmth it offered was theoretical. His name was not important. What mattered was that he had once sailed, long before the King's War, long before the taxes on salt and the disappearance of his left eye. He remembered better boats. Or at least, he remembered boats that leaked more slowly. He muttered things sometimes, about cities that didn't exist and treasures that sparkled in memory like broken glass in sunlight. No one listened closely. He spoke with the voice of the sea, constant, vague, and mostly background. But sometimes, at night, the boys of the village would sneak out, sit on overturned crates, and listen to him speak while pretending not to. There was something in the rhythm of his stories, in the way he described sails ballooning with wind, that tugged at the edges of their hunger. Hunger not for food, though that too, always, but for elsewhere. They didn't yet know the smell of gunpowder, nor the weight of wet gold. But they knew the creak of timber beneath bare feet, the slap of cold spray, and the shape of longing. And in that, the sea had already marked them. One such boy, lanky and constantly itching from wool that had been someone else's blanket, watched the horizon every morning. Not because he expected anything to come from it, but because it felt like staring into a doorway that might, one day, creak open. He had no plan. Plans were for people who had choices. He had weather, and splinters, and an ear for stories. And occasionally, when the wind shifted just right, he thought he could hear the ocean whisper, not words, not really. Just invitation. There was no school in the village, but people learned. They learned how to tell time by the shadow of the boats against the pier. They learned the difference between a sky that promised wind and one that threatened it. They learned to gut fish, patch sails, and ignore the ache of cold feet in wet boots. These were not lessons written in ink, but in bruises, splinters, and the endless repetition of tasks older than memory. And there were other lessons, too, quieter ones. How to wait. How to want something without saying it out loud. How to listen for the crack in someone's silence, and read the weather in a stranger's face. These were the skills of the poor and the sea-bound, and no man reached old age without them. The boy, still nameless, for names meant little until someone else had reason to say them, spent his mornings near the docks, not out of obligation, but proximity. His family's hut leaned against the boathouse like a drunk friend, borrowing its shadow. Inside, his father rarely spoke, his hands warped by rope work and cold. His mother had died long ago, though she lingered in the scent of rosemary and fish oil that still clung to a corner of the hearth. He took to wandering early, his footsteps soft over frost-bitten grass and planks slick with sea slime. The gulls screamed overhead like angry schoolmasters, and the waves offered the only lullaby the village knew. Sometimes he would find fragments, splinters of ships, discarded hooks, bits of tarred rope, and hoard them in a small wooden box beneath the floorboards. He didn't know why, but it felt important to keep things the sea gave back. Life was neither fair nor unfair, it simply was. The same way the wind was, shifting, biting, familiar. And in that steady discomfort, the people found a strange sort of rhythm. They ate what the sea allowed. They mended what tore. They sang songs that no longer rhymed and told stories they didn't believe. And sometimes, just often enough, a stranger would arrive. It was rare, but not unheard of. Once every few months, a figure would appear on the beach, walking along the wet line between surf and shore. These men rarely stayed long. Their coats were better, their boots less patched, and their eyes always looking beyond the village as if measuring its smallness. Some said they were merchants, others deserters. A few whispered, "Pirate," though no one used the word loudly. The sea had ears. One such man arrived in early spring, when the frost was just beginning to unclench its fingers from the earth. He came on foot, carrying nothing but a satchel that jingled faintly when he walked. His beard was trimmed, though travel-worn, and his gaze held the odd blend of weariness and calculation common to men who'd sailed far and lied more. He said little. He didn't need to. The moment he stepped into the village, it shifted, just slightly, like a deck tilting underfoot. The air thickened with curiosity. Children followed him, pretending they weren't. Elders watched from doorways, squinting against the wind. The boy noticed too, of course. He didn't speak to the man, but he saw the way others did, how they leaned in when he passed, how their voices dropped a little lower after he was gone. Later that week, rumors began to circle like gulls after fish scraps. Some said he carried gold, others, a letter from the king himself. A few claimed he'd been to the southern ports where the wine was red and sweet, and the jails were lined with silver. No one could agree, except on one detail. He was looking for a crew. No one knew what kind of voyage or for whom. He didn't post notices. He didn't ask directly. But questions hung in the wind like drying nets, and more than a few men began mending boats that hadn't sailed in years. The boy listened. He listened when men argued near the docks, when they cursed quietly at the cost of pitch and nails. He listened when someone mentioned letters of marque, and again when someone muttered blood money. And though he was not invited, he understood something was changing. One morning, he found the stranger sitting on a barrel near the edge of the pier, staring out at the sea. The tide was low, revealing slick rocks and tangled seaweed, and the sky above was a bruised sort of gray. The boy sat a short distance away, pretending to pick at the wood, but truly just listening. The man spoke without turning. "Do you know the wind by smell?" he asked, as if continuing a conversation the boy hadn't started. The boy didn't answer. "You will," the man said, "if the sea takes you." That was all. He stood and walked away, his boots clicking against the dock, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of tobacco and leather. That night, the boy added a small, rusted compass to his box of treasures. He had found it earlier, discarded beside the storage shed, and though the needle no longer pointed north, it spun beautifully whenever he breathed near it. He didn't know where north was anyway, but he liked the idea of direction. By the end of that month, 2 boats were being readied. Their sails, patched and yellowed, were spread across the beach like strange albino wings drying in the sun. Barrels were filled with salted fish and hard bread that could be used as hammering tools if necessary. There were whispers now, not just curiosity, but commitment. A voyage was coming. A voyage, and with it, a promise, of something different, if not better. And the boy, still without a name, still barefoot most days, stood a little straighter. He didn't speak more. He didn't beg to go. But every morning, he stood by the pier, watching the horizon, and waiting for the wind to say his name. Chapter 2: A Letter, a Ship, and a Loophole. The letter arrived folded in a way that suggested ceremony, though the edges were already softened by salt air and fingers too rough for parchment. It bore a seal, not wax, but an embossed stamp pressed with something heavy, something real. A lion rampant above crossed anchors. It smelled faintly of resin, old wood, and the kind of ink that stains more than paper. No one knew who delivered it. It simply appeared, tucked beneath the warped door of the village's makeshift hall, the same place where herring were salted in winter and arguments about nets echoed all year. Someone said the stranger had left it. Others claimed it blew in on the wind. But when it was opened, even the skeptical leaned closer. It was a commission or something that passed for one. The document was penned in neat, controlled script, each letter as disciplined as a soldier's march. It spoke of Her Majesty's authority, of licensed interdiction, and the disruption of enemy trade. There was no mention of piracy, naturally. Just opportunity. Legal opportunity. With royal suggestion. At the bottom, a signature flourished like a sail in full wind. Not the monarch herself, of course, but someone close enough to pretend. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. Just to bearer and crew. And yet, somehow, it was understood that it was meant for them. There were no names. No specific ship. No time frame. And therein lay the beauty of it. It was vague enough to be useful. A document that could be produced with a solemn face in one port, then conveniently hidden in another. It was permission, but only if you survived long enough to prove it had been given. It was not the first time such letters had drifted down into the hands of desperate men. Nor would it be the last. The village responded as it often did, with silence at first, then motion. One of the older boats was dragged from where it had been sleeping beneath a pile of fish crates and sea grass. The wren, its name barely legible through the layers of moss and resignation, was stripped down and scrubbed with vinegar and sand. Boards were hammered back into place. Sails were patched with old tunics. Tar was heated in stolen pots and slathered along its belly like medicine on a wound. The boy watched all of it, eyes wide, heart beating with a rhythm he didn't yet understand. He wasn't invited, but he wasn't told to leave either. That was permission enough. Crewing a vessel did not require resumes. It required a willingness to lose things: warmth, time, blood. Men volunteered with the same faces they wore to funerals, resigned, yet stubborn. They brought what they had: knives, ropes, flasks, memories of better boats. Some had once fished. Some had once fought. A few had done both at the same time. The stranger, the one who might have brought the letter or might have just known when it would arrive, said little. But he was the one with the coat that didn't leak and the boots that didn't squeak. So when he pointed at a sail or grunted at a barrel, people listened. He didn't call himself a captain. No one else did either. But he carried himself like someone who expected to be followed, and he was. The boy spent his days near the dock, coiling rope not because it needed to be coiled, but because it gave him something to do with his hands. He carried messages between men who already knew what the answers would be. He fetched water and learned which buckets leaked. He did not speak much, but he watched everything. At night, he lay awake on the floor beside the hearth, listening to the old man mumble through his dreams. Sometimes names spilled out, places, ports, women, storms. Sometimes only curses. The boy memorized them anyway, like charms against the unknown. By the end of the second week, the wren looked less like a corpse and more like a gamble. Her hull no longer wept openly. Her mast stood a little straighter. Someone had painted a new eye on the bow, though it was slightly crooked and resembled a surprised fish. Provisions were gathered. Dried fish, hardtack, a small barrel of apples already halfway to cider. Fresh water in cracked casks sealed with wax. A compass that didn't spin. 2 rusty cutlasses and a small cannon that had once decorated a governor's garden. No one knew how long the voyage would be, or where it would go. That wasn't the point. The point was this: they had a letter that, if waved with enough confidence and squinted at from the right angle, looked very much like legitimacy. It was, in short, a loophole, and loopholes were the true currency of seafaring men. They left at dawn, because that's what stories prefer. Not for poetic effect, though the mist curling over the tide-like fingers was certainly cooperative, but because dawn meant wind, and wind meant movement. There was no ceremony. No cheering from the docks, no coins tossed for luck. Only the dull creak of wet rope, the groan of wood realigning with its ancient burdens, and a silence so complete it seemed almost superstitious. The wren did not leap into the waves like a bird reborn. She hesitated, shuddered, then surrendered. The water took her the way it took everything, slowly, completely, and with the casual indifference of time itself. The crew was small, barely 10 souls, each with their own reasons for leaving and none they cared to explain. They spread across the deck like furniture too long left in storage, each man testing his footing, reacquainting his legs with the unpredictable rhythm of motion. The boy had no assigned place. He simply was, on the edge of the group, near the rigging, near anything that looked useful and unoccupied. No one told him to go. No one told him to stay. So he stayed. The sails, stitched together from linen, sailcloth, and dreams, filled reluctantly. They snapped once, loud enough to make everyone flinch, then settled into a tense billow. The ship, begrudgingly, moved. The sea was calm, which did not mean kind. It meant deceptive. The water rolled gently beneath them, heavy with silence. The horizon stretched on in every direction, unbroken except by the occasional floating log or bird with nowhere else to be. Within hours, the smell of land, mud, manure, fish, faded, replaced by salt, tar, and the kind of mildew that no amount of scrubbing could truly erase. Every crevice of the ship offered its own bouquet: damp rope, old canvas, spilled oil, and something beneath the planks that might once have been potatoes. Or rats. The boy leaned over the rail, not to vomit, though that would come soon enough, but to breathe something other than recycled breath. The wind whipped his hair into his mouth. He did not mind. Below deck, the air was thick and warm with collective humanity. The space was low enough that grown men hunched by instinct, even when seated. It was lined with hammocks that smelled of previous owners and dreams they'd left behind. Barrels knocked together with soft thuds, and something dripped slowly in the dark. Meals were a ritual of resignation. Salted fish so dry it flaked like old plaster. Bread harder than the ship's deck. Water that tasted of wood, iron, and something else best left unconsidered. Conversation was sparse, broken by coughs and the occasional muttered curse. By the second day, the boy found that his world had narrowed. Not just to the ship, but to the space of his own limbs. Movement required calculation. Balance was not optional. The ship rolled even when the sea seemed still, and walking in a straight line became a forgotten art. He learned fast, mostly by failing. He learned how to duck a swinging boom without losing teeth. How to lash a rope so it stayed knotted when the rain came. How to stand with knees bent just enough to become part of the ship rather than a passenger of it. He learned to listen, not just to voices, but to the creaks and groans of the vessel itself. The ship spoke in wood and wind. It warned sometimes. Other times it complained. It was never silent. Nights were worst. The cold was a clawed thing, slipping into boots and under collars. The dark was thick, as if the world outside the lanterns simply stopped existing. And dreams, when they came, were full of water. The stranger, now more clearly the ship's leader, kept mostly to himself. He spoke only when necessary, but his silence carried authority. When he did speak, it was with precision, short sentences that cut through noise like a knife through wet bread. He navigated with an old chart, a newer compass, and an instinct that made the crew uneasy. He didn't explain their heading. He didn't need to. The letter, stuffed in an oilskin pouch and kept somewhere near his chest, was explanation enough. And yet, already, there were doubts. They came like dampness, slowly, invisibly, until suddenly everything felt wet. A storm on the second night battered the Wren with sideways rain and wind that whistled like a curse. The rigging shrieked. One sail tore. A barrel broke loose and slammed against a man's leg with a sound no one wanted to investigate. They survived it, but only barely. And in the aftermath, questions began, soft, like rats in the hold. Where exactly were they going? How long would the provisions last? What if the letter wasn't real? The boy didn't ask these things aloud, but he felt them in every sideways glance, every extra second someone stared at the captain's oilskin pouch. The sea had a way of eroding certainty. Still, they pressed on. Because turning back was more shameful than pressing forward, and shame was a heavier anchor than any chain. One morning, just after the horizon swallowed the last outline of familiar land, they saw another ship. Distant, small, a smudge on the SEA.it did not approach. It merely existed, but for the crew of the Wren, it was enough. A reminder that they were not alone, and that somewhere, out there, opportunity still floated, ready to be boarded, plundered, or escaped from. Chapter 3: Bread Made of Sawdust and Other Joys of Naval Life. 3 weeks at sea and no one sang anymore. Not because spirits were low, though they were slumping like wet sacks, but because singing took breath, and breath was better spent complaining, or sleeping, or chewing through biscuits that could be used as anchors in an emergency. The sea stretched endlessly, gray and glassy. It offered no comfort, no adventure, just motion, slow, constant, nauseating. The Wren groaned as if bored with her own voyage, and the men aboard had begun to echo her sentiment. Mornings began with the sound of coughing. Not polite, dry coughs, but wet, chest-deep hacks that suggested mold had found a new home in someone's lungs. The air below deck was thick with breath, oil smoke, and the sour reek of old food. Condensation dripped from the beams like nervous sweat. The boy, now accepted enough to be ignored, had claimed a spot near the stern where the wind occasionally reached. He wrapped himself in a blanket that smelled of brine and goat, and counted the stars when the clouds allowed. He knew some of their names now, not the real names, but the ones the crew gave them: Broken Tooth, Drunk Widow, Captain's Lie. Constellations stitched by sailors into the fabric of their loneliness. Meals were events, not because they were good, but because they were shared. Each man received his ration: a strip of dried meat that could be mistaken for wood, a biscuit that shattered on contact with teeth, and a ladle of water that somehow tasted of tin and memories. Mold was a regular guest. Sometimes green, sometimes black, always enthusiastic. The crew developed strategies. One man scraped the top off his bread with the edge of a dagger and declared the rest clean. Another insisted that soaking the biscuit in water for 10 minutes made it soupy. A third just chewed slowly, like a cow resigned to hay. The boy discovered that if he closed his eyes while eating, he could pretend it was something else. Not better, just different. His imagination was strong, but not that strong. There was no privacy on the ship. Every sound traveled. Every smell lingered. Snoring, groaning, muttering, farting, it all mingled into a chorus that never ceased. Even the sea, for all its vastness, could not drown the human orchestra. Hygiene was a matter of proximity rather than effort. Clothes were not washed, only aired out. Hair was left to its own devices. Teeth were more rumor than reality. The occasional rain shower became a bathing opportunity, but only if you didn't mind the wind slapping your dignity with icy hands. And yet, despite all this, no one truly complained. Not the way people on land complain about boots that pinch or soup that's too salty. At sea, complaint was another form of breathing. It filled the space between orders and sleep. It bonded men more effectively than song. The stranger, the not-quite captain, maintained his distance. He spoke when necessary, charted their course with calm precision, and made no effort to win affection. The letter, now slightly more creased and salt-kissed, remained tucked in his oilskin pouch, like a promise or a threat. Morale remained afloat through small victories. One morning, a man caught a flying fish with his bare hands. It was celebrated like a royal feast, split unevenly, chewed reverently, remembered fondly. Another day, the rain stopped for 6 whole hours, and someone found a boot that fit both feet. The boy, in his quiet corner, found peace and rhythm. He learned the timbre of each man's footsteps on the deck, the way the ship shifted when the wind changed, the low rattle that meant a nail was working loose somewhere in the hull. He became fluent in wood. One afternoon, he sat on the deck with a piece of line and taught himself knots. Not the ones that hold things together, but the ones sailors tie for comfort, knots with no purpose except to keep hands busy and thoughts slow. A man named Corlin, whose beard seemed more permanent than his teeth, watched the boy work and grunted approval. "Better that than picking at your skin," he said, then wandered off muttering about rope burns and ghosts. There were no stories of glory anymore. No talk of gold or victory. Just small things: how best to coil a line, which barrel leaked less, which corner of the deck dried fastest after rain, and dreams. Those were changing, too. The boy, who once dreamt of open water and great ships, now dreamed of bread that didn't fight back, of boots that didn't smell like mushrooms, and of sleep that wasn't interrupted by someone stepping on his arm. But still, he did not want to go back. Not really. Because in all its discomfort and rot, the sea was honest, and honesty, no matter how cold or damp, had a strange comfort of its own. It smelled like its own secrets. There was the scent of rope, dry, then damp, then dry again, like it was trying to decide whether to mold. There was the smell of bodies that hadn't touched earth in over a month. Sweat turned stale, clothes turned sour, and skin turned gray in the dim underdeck light. The scent of fish oil still clung to every surface, though no fish had been seen in days. Even the wood seemed to protest. Planks began to warp, groan, and in one case cough, though that may have been the man leaning against it. The boy now knew the names of nearly everyone on board, even if none had been offered directly. Names were passed by reference. "Ask Red Nose if the bucket's done," or "Tell Sleeping Horse his boots are leaking again." He learned them the way the ship learned storms, gradually, with creaks and splashes. There was Jellin, who hadn't stopped scratching since week 2. Mare, who once claimed to have seen a mermaid and now wouldn't stop staring at the water, as if waiting for her return. Tub, who snored with such depth that rats changed their routes to avoid him. And there was Corlin, who taught the boy how to chew tobacco without choking. He failed. "Tastes like a boot and burns like regret," the man said with pride, then spat overboard and grinned at nothing in particular. Food was now strategy. Mold was triaged, green was carved off, black was bargained with, and anything moving was declared protein. The biscuit barrel had gone soft. Not the biscuits, the barrel. One man tapped it, and his finger went through. No one talked about what that meant. Water supplies were stretched with rain collection. Tarps were laid out at night, funneling whatever the sky allowed into barrels half filled with hope. The taste didn't matter anymore. Only the wetness. Illness came quietly. First a cough that wouldn't leave. Then a fever. Then a silence that stretched too long beneath a hammock. They buried the first man at sea on a Tuesday. His name had never been asked. He had once laughed at his own farts. That was the last thing most remembered. The ceremony was short. A prayer was muttered. A few coins were kept, his belt claimed by another, and his body wrapped in canvas that still smelled of smoked fish. The splash he made was brief. The water, as always, took and moved on. After that, the men became more reserved. They did their tasks, they said little, and they watched each other with the slow awareness of shared fragility. Eyes became sharper. Fingers lingered near knives longer than needed. Trust stretched thin, like old rope drying unevenly, and always, the letter remained, still in the captain's pouch, still unspecific, still powerful. It had become a kind of talisman. Some stared at it like it promised salvation. Others like it whispered betrayal. The boy wasn't sure which made more sense. One night, he overheard a conversation, half-whispered, under the creak of sailcloth. "They won't miss one boat. Privateers," they said. "With papers. Papers mean nothing when there's no one to read them. Cargo's just sitting there." Silence, then. "And we do have the letter." By morning, a change had settled over the crew, not loud or sudden, but weighty. As if the ship had taken on something invisible, something heavy and moral and damp. They altered course by a few degrees. No announcement. No reason, just a shift. The stranger, captain, commander, or merely the man who held the map, stood at the bow longer now. He said little, but the look in his eyes had changed. Less distance. More calculation. The boy didn't understand entirely. But he knew the difference between drifting and aiming. And now, they were aiming. It wasn't treasure they smelled. Not yet. But something profitable. Something worth the mold, and the cold, and the cough that still hadn't gone away. The sea was no longer vast. It was narrowing. And in that narrowing, the letter in the pouch began to feel heavier than any anchor. Chapter 4. The Art of Floating Violence. It began, as many things at sea did, not with certainty, but with a smudge. Just past the horizon, where sky met water in a wavering handshake of heat and haze, a shape hovered, too steady for a cloud, too deliberate for driftwood, and too far for clear judgment. It was the kind of silhouette that turned stomachs before minds could catch up, the kind that reminded even the boldest sailor that nothing ever floated out there by accident. The crew gathered slowly, each man feigning indifference as he found a reason to glance that way. Some mended ropes that didn't need mending, others pretended to check sails already trimmed, but all of them, in one way or another, were watching that mark on the edge of the sea. No one called it a merchantman, or a patrol, or anything at all, not out loud. Naming things gave them power, and power, when you're not certain of your own, is best left unsummoned. The captain, if he could still be called that, stood near the helm, arms crossed, eyes squinting through sun and suspicion. He said nothing, just adjusted their course by a breath, and the wren, obedient and uncomplaining, shifted toward the shadow. The boy noticed it before most, the way the ship moved not in response to the wind, but in accordance with intent. This wasn't drift, it wasn't exploration, it was pursuit, slow and subtle, like a cat stalking something it wasn't yet sure it could catch. By afternoon, the smudge had grown substance. It had sails, square-rigged, patched and tired-looking, flapping like overworked flags. The hull was wide, squat, and low in the water, A ship heavy with cargo or poorly maintained, or both. She wasn't fast. That mattered. The crew, once unified by hunger and mold, now separated into quiet clusters. Some sharpened blades not because they expected to use them, but because the motion was familiar. Others checked the cannon, the single, laughable thing mounted near the bow, still more decoration than weapon, but now taken seriously, as if it might remember how to roar. No one mentioned the letter. They all knew it was there, pressed between oilskin folds, ready to be waved or hidden as the situation demanded, its language vague enough to allow either interpretation. But today, it didn't matter what it said. What mattered was how fast they could approach, how quick they could board, and how loudly they could convince themselves they were still acting under royal permission. As dusk crept in, they came close enough to smell the other ship, not literally, but in the way a sailor reads sails and lines, in the droop of canvas and the tilt of rudder, in the silence that echoed across too many open feet of ocean. She wasn't running. Either she didn't see them as a threat, or she couldn't do anything about it. That night, plans were not made so much as assumed. Knives were tucked into boots. Rope was coiled for grappling, not storage. The boy was given a small hatchet, not because anyone expected him to fight, but because empty hands had no place in this kind of encounter. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by the moan of stressed planks and the whisper of sails adjusting to a hunter's angle. The sea, usually indifferent, now felt tense, as if holding its own breath. At dawn, they were within hailing distance. The other ship bore no name on its hull, or if it had once, it had been weathered away, erased by waves and perhaps intention. There was no flag, no signal, no pretense of welcome, and so the Wren approached like a question. When they came close enough, the captain finally spoke, not to the other ship, but to his own crew. His voice was low, but firm, like a line drawn in wet sand. They don't answer, we go aboard. If they answer wrong, we go aboard. If they throw bread, or curses, or pretend to pray, we go aboard. The men nodded not because they agreed, but because agreement was irrelevant. Action had inertia, and they were already falling forward. Hooks were thrown, not elegant, just iron and rope, biting into wood like teeth. The ships kissed with a shudder, hull against hull, as if groaning in shared resignation. The boy felt the impact in his knees, a deep vibration that traveled up his spine and settled somewhere behind his eyes. Crossing was not theatrical. There were no battle cries, no choreographed leaps. Men climbed, slipped, scrambled, shoved. The boy followed, feet unsure, heart louder than his thoughts, hand clutching the useless hatchet like a superstition. There was resistance, but it was tired, panicked, uncoordinated. A man swung an oar and was met with a rope to the face. Another tried to push a board across the deck and was kicked through it. The crew of the Wren, no longer bound by restraint or ambiguity, moved quickly, efficiently, like men who had long rehearsed something they pretended not to want. The boy stayed near the edge, eyes wide, breast shallow, watching not the fighting, but the rhythm of it, the way choices turned to violence without changing expression. No one looked angry. No one shouted in rage. They were just doing. In under 10 minutes, the deck was theirs. The other crew, what remained, was gathered near the foremast, hands raised, faces slack with disbelief. They weren't soldiers, or smugglers, or pirates. They were merchants, maybe, or fishermen turned traders. They had no defense, only confusion, and that made them dangerous in a different way, because they reminded the attackers of who they once were. The letter was not shown. Instead, barrels were opened, crates pried apart. Anything of value was catalogued in glances and grunts. Dried fruits, spices, 2 bolts of linen, a small coffer of coins not enough to justify what had just occurred. The captain walked the planks like a priest at a false altar, offering no absolution, only calculation. We leave them the food, he said, voice dry. We take the sailcloth. And the charts. And the compass if it spins. No one argued. The boy, still gripping the hatchet, still unsure whether he was meant to help or bear witness, looked down at a sailor from the other ship, an old man, face slack with fear or exhaustion or both. Their eyes met, just for a breath. No words passed between them, but something heavier did. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. By midday, the Wren had peeled away, sails heavy with new fabric, decks slightly lower with the weight of other men's goods, and silence stretching longer than usual. No one sang. No one cheered. No one called it what it was. Because floating violence, when performed with enough precision, looks very much like survival. The sea had not changed. Its color remained a muted slate, its rhythm as steady as ever, its indifference intact. But on the Wren, something had shifted, not in the timbers, which still groaned with their usual complaints, nor in the sails, which filled as obediently as before, but in the space between the men, in the quiet. There was no retelling of the raid. No laughter over clever strikes, no boast exchanged over bruises or coin. The crew spoke only when necessary, and when they did, it was as if the words emerged from under layers of salt and weight. Even the boy, who had barely crossed the deck of the other ship, could feel it, that low, taut pressure that lived in the chest and throat, the kind that made your mouth feel dry even when you drank. Corlin, once loud and casually profane, now muttered only to his hands, which he scrubbed often, though they were no dirtier than usual. Maire, who used to hum to himself, now stood near the prow most nights, his eyes on the horizon, lips unmoving, as if he were afraid to breathe too loudly. And the captain, who had made the decision without a flicker of hesitation, spent his hours in the narrow space between cabin and helm, not hiding, not explaining, just present, like a statue carved from quiet authority and something colder. The boy felt it most clearly in the air below deck. It was thicker now, not from heat or humidity, but from tension, like the space had grown aware of itself. Hammocks swung more gently, boots were set down more carefully, even the coughs seemed to muffle themselves, as though sound itself knew better than to echo. They didn't talk about the letter anymore. It had become a joke no one wanted to tell. It still existed, folded and well-wrapped, still bearing its seal, still capable of being produced should another ship appear with questions and better weapons, but it had lost its weight, or perhaps gained too much. No one asked what came next. There was still food in the barrels, still water, though growing stale, still wind in the sails. But direction, once a matter of maps and magnetic guesses, now seemed guided more by instinct than plan, or perhaps by avoidance, like they were sailing not towards something but away from what they had become. The boy spent his time as he always had, working when asked, watching when left alone, but now he saw things differently. He noticed how men cleaned their blades longer than necessary, how no one looked directly at the hatchet he had never used. He found a small corner of deck near the aft rail and took to sitting there, running rope through his hands, nodding and unnodding with no purpose, only rhythm. Some nights, he would wake to murmurs, voices in the dark, low and urgent, never loud enough to catch words but always laced with tension. Other times, he'd wake to complete silence, the kind so thick it made him doubt his own breathing. And always there was the sea, eternal, unbothered, reflecting none of their questions, offering only space. They passed a small island once, nothing more than a mound of rock and brush, too small to land on, too steep to shelter behind. No one spoke of stopping. No one even pointed. They passed it like a bad dream in daylight, their eyes trained forward, their backs straight and not with pride but defense. A week later, the boy watched as one of the crew, Daniel, whose eyes had always been too sharp, quietly tossed a handful of coins overboard. No explanation. No drama. Just the soft clink of metal against wood, and the quieter sound of it vanishing beneath the waves. The boy didn't ask. He simply remembered. Something had been taken on that other ship, not just sailcloth and fruit, but something harder to carry and impossible to leave behind. The kind of weight that settled into joints and breath, that made the rigging creak louder and the nights feel colder even when the wind was still. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with slow bruises, the captain stood near the helm and spoke without turning. "We do what we must," he said, not to anyone in particular, and perhaps not even to the crew. No one answered. There was nothing left to say, because the truth was simple, and heavy, and unwelcome. Once you learn how to take, it becomes harder to remember how not to. And on the sea, where laws were written in distance and loopholes, forgetting came easier than forgiveness. Chapter 5: The Coastal Dance of Pretend Allegiances. They made landfall just after dusk, not because it was tactically ideal, but because the tide had finally stopped arguing and the wind had grown too lazy to care. The port wasn't marked on most maps, or if it was, it went by 3 different names depending on who was asking and how much they were paying. From the water, it looked like a handful of buildings had washed up against the cliffs and decided to stay, their walls leaning into each other like drunks at closing time. Lanterns flickered in the windows, casting thin, buttery light that shimmered across the waves like false invitations. The dock itself was a patchwork of old timber, barrels, and ambition. No guards waited at its end. Only a boy with a missing boot and a torch too small for its pole. The wren was not announced. She drifted in quietly, hugging the tide like a secret, her sails slack, her hull heavy with goods that still smelled faintly of someone else's hold. No flags were raised. No names were declared. In this place, introductions were made not with documents but with posture. Once moored, the crew stepped ashore one by one, not in uniform, not in haste, but with that casual, practiced gait of men who wanted to look as though they had nothing to prove and even less to hide. Their boots clicked against the dock, slow and measured, like they were testing whether the land still remembered them. The boy followed, his eyes wide in the lamplight, not from fear or awe, but from a kind of hungry curiosity. Because ports were full of things you could never find at sea: color, noise, food that didn't fight back, and people who knew how to lie with style. The market lay just uphill, beneath a crooked row of wooden awnings strung with frayed cloth and dried herbs. Here, the air smelled different, of tanned leather, roasted fish, stale ale, and the subtle sweetness of things just beginning to rot. Voices overlapped in a murmur of half-languages and false promises. Nothing was sold at its real price. Nothing was called by its real name. The captain spoke to no one. He moved through the port like he had a right to it, not pushing, not hiding, just existing at an angle that made others step aside. Behind him, the crew dispersed, each man swallowed by a different stall, a different alley, a different scheme. Deals were made without handshakes. Goods passed from cart to crate without ever being named. A crate of spice became sea bark. A bolt of cloth became storm canvas. And coins, always damp, always suspect, clinked between palms with just enough friction to feel legitimate. The letter never appeared. I in this place. It would have meant less than a wink. Because this was a port that survived not by laws, but by balance, where everyone was guilty, and no one dared to notice. The dockmaster, if he existed, was more bartender than bureaucrat. His books were blank, his questions rhetorical, and his ledgers lined in drink. One of the crew, broad-shouldered and sunburned, traded a bolt of stolen linen for a pouch of glass beads and a leather satchel full of dried figs. Another returned with a jug marked as olive oil, which sloshed like something less noble. The boy watched all of it from behind a barrel, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood as if trying to memorize its texture, his mind absorbing the rhythm of trade not governed by fairness, but by confidence. In one corner of the market, beneath an awning stitched with what may have once been a sail, sat a woman with a table full of tools, not knives, not quite. Hooks, awls, hinges, pieces of iron shaped by hands that knew what doors should stay shut and what chests should not. Her face was unreadable, but her hands moved with the quiet skill of someone who never forgot what pain sounded like. She sold nothing. She traded in favors. The captain spoke to her briefly, nodded once, and left a single coin on the table, larger than the others, older than the others, the kind of currency that bought more than objects. The boy didn't know what had been exchanged, but something had shifted. He could feel it in the way the captain's shoulders relaxed, in the way his boots struck the stone more firmly as he walked away. Later, back at the dock, the wren groaned under the weight of its new cargo, lighter in mass, heavier in implication. Barrels that no one labeled. Packages that no one opened. Objects wrapped in oilskin and tied with cords that weren't knotted for beauty. The crew reassembled, less like a team, more like scattered thoughts pulled back into a single sentence. They said little, but their hands were full and their eyes darted like lantern flames in wind. That night, on the deck, beneath a sky riddled with half-clouds and stars sharp as old nails, the boy sat near the helm and listened to the port disappear behind them, its lights fading, its lies cooling, its secrets drifting back into the sea. And though the sails were full again, and the ship pointed outward, he couldn't shake the feeling that something of the port had stayed with them, not in the cargo hold, not in the crates, but in the silence that now felt more practiced, more permanent. Because in a place where allegiance is a flavor sold by the spoonful, and names shift like tide maps, the only truth that lasts is what you carry in your silence. By the time the lights of the port had vanished behind them, reduced to faint stars that blinked reluctantly over the sea's curve, the ship had already begun to feel different, not in motion or direction, which remained steady, but in weight, and not just the physical sort measured by planks and barrels. What they had taken aboard back there, whatever passed through those stalls and palms, hadn't just settled into the hold. It had sunk into the wood, into the rope, into the very wind that now moved the Wren forward with a kind of quiet obligation. The crew didn't talk about the deals. They rarely did. But this silence was different, not the familiar lull of men worn down by salt and time, but something closer to avoidance. Like each man had walked out of the port with not only goods in his arms, but a secret behind his eyes. The boy noticed it most in the way they looked at one another, not suspicion, not exactly, but a kind of calculation. They glanced longer than necessary, as if trying to determine how much someone else had gained, or what they might have promised in exchange. The wind was steady now, cool and honest, the kind of wind that should have cleared minds and lifted moods, but the sails above, though full, seemed to sag somehow in spirit. The ship moved forward, but the people on it remained anchored in the events of that place, dragging invisible chains of unspoken trades and undeclared allegiances. The captain, still without title but unquestioned in authority, spent more time alone. He took his meals near the helm, eyes scanning not the horizon but the deck, watching more than leading, measuring the mood of his crew as though preparing for a storm that wasn't in the sky. At night the ship's rhythm shifted. Men stayed up later, whispered in pairs, and slept with blades closer than before. No one named it paranoia, but it curled through the corridors like smoke with nowhere to escape. The boy, who had grown accustomed to the creaks and groans of the ship's belly, now heard them differently, each knock of wood against wood now a question, each flap of canvas a sigh. The goods they carried were not spoken of. No manifest had been written, no inventory taken aloud. Yet everyone knew what they weren't supposed to know. Barrels that were too heavy for olives. Crates that didn't slosh like wine. Packages that hummed faintly when the ship rolled too hard. One night, the boy caught a glimpse of something wrapped in dark cloth and sealed with wax, a symbol stamped into the top that he didn't recognize, but which made his skin feel colder than the wind. Still, they sailed. Because to stop was to explain, and no one was ready for that. They passed other ships, but at a distance, thin silhouettes across the water, with sails trimmed tight and eyes likely just as wary. The Wren did not hail them. She sailed in silence, trusting that the water between them would do what paperwork could not. One morning, they saw smoke on the horizon, not fire, not alarm, just the gentle curl of civilization in the distance. The kind of signal that meant warmth, trade, questions. The captain adjusted course away from it. No explanation offered. None needed. The boy spent his hours coiling rope, cleaning tools, and listening. He had grown used to his own quiet, but now he felt surrounded by it, pressing in on all sides, not empty, but full of words unsaid. He watched the men speak in shorter bursts, watched their hands linger over their pockets, watched the way their laughter no longer reached their eyes. Even Corlin, who once seemed immune to guilt or memory, now stared too long at the horizon, mouth twitching with words that never formed. Mare stopped humming altogether, and Tub, whose voice was once louder than the sails, now measured his footsteps like someone sneaking through a house he didn't belong in. And the captain, he began to keep a small journal, written not for memory, but perhaps for defense. Pages filled in ink that bled slightly with the ship's motion, hidden behind a lock that rusted too quickly. The boy saw him riding once at dawn, lips moving without sound, eyes unfocused as though seeing both the page and something much further away. Then, one night, it rained, not the usual mist or soft drizzle, but a full, soaking storm that came without thunder, just a relentless curtain of water and cold. The crew worked as they always did, fast, together, wordlessly. But when the sails were tied and the barrels secured, no one sang, no one told stories, no one even cursed. They just stood, dripping and silent, letting the rain wash what it could. And in that silence, the boy understood something he hadn't before. It wasn't the cargo that was changing them. It wasn't even the violence, or the deception. It was the knowledge that they had chosen it. That given wind and time and a port that asked no questions, they had stepped willingly into something murkier than seawater. And once chosen, some things travel with you, whether or not you pack them. Chapter 6: Storms, Stars, and Things That Leak. The first sign of the storm wasn't the wind. It was the silence of the birds. For days, gulls had followed them, a chorus of irritation and hunger, circling the masts like old debts. But one morning, they were simply gone, as if pulled upward by some unseen current, or warned off by a sound no man could hear. The air that day was too still, too heavy, like breath held too long, like fabric soaked in oil just before it meets flame. The sails sagged as if sulking, the ropes felt thicker in the hands, and the sea lost its usual rhythm, becoming not calmer, but quieter, like something was waiting just beneath. The boy noticed it in the sky first, not in the color, but in the way the clouds formed shapes that didn't hold, shifting like thoughts you can't quite catch. The horizon no longer looked like a line. It looked like a mistake. Still, they sailed. Because turning back was never really a choice, and slowing down meant asking questions, and no one wanted to do either. By evening, the sky had darkened in uneven patches. It was not night yet, but the sun had already lost its authority. The clouds rolled in not from one direction, but from several, like arguments converging. The captain stood at the helm with the stillness of a man who has seen storms before and knows that movement, not panic, is the only thing that earns you survival. He issued orders with a flat calmness that made them feel heavier, lashed the barrels, reefed the mainsail, double-checked the rigging, secured the holds. Everything was said only once, and no one questioned. Everyone moved. The boy was sent below deck, not out of mercy, but out of strategy. He was lighter than the others, less essential above, more easily thrown. So he sat in the dark beside a stack of crates that smelled of oil, salt, and faintly, of whatever port they'd last visited, though now even that scent was fading beneath the stronger, thicker smell of approaching rain. The first drop hit like a pebble. Not soft, not cold, just solid, like it meant something. Then another, then 100, then 1,000, each one drumming against the deck above like fingers on a coffin lid. The storm did not arrive. It claimed. Wind tore through the rigging with a sound like screaming rope. The sails, half furled, caught the gust like startled lungs and snapped taut with bone-deep thuds. The ship rolled, not gently, not rhythmically, but violently, like a thought interrupted mid-sentence, like a slap. Voices above turned from commands to yells, then from yells to grunts, then to silence again, broken only by the groan of the hull and the slap of water against wood that was never built for such fury. Below deck, the boy clung to a beam slick with sweat and seawater, each jolt of the ship jarring his spine, each creak a question the wood asked of itself. How much longer can we hold? Barrels shifted despite the lashing. A crate toppled, cracked open, revealed its contents. Nothing dangerous, just cloth, but even fabric, when wet and flung by motion, can bruise. A lantern broke somewhere near the bow. Smoke filled the space briefly, then the sting of extinguished flame. He couldn't see the faces of the men above, but he could hear the strain in their footsteps, the scuff of boots dragged against wet planks, the sharp thud of a body hitting a rail. And beneath it all, the endless drumbeat of rain on canvas, on flesh, on history. Hours passed. Or minutes. Or days. Time slipped sideways in storms. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the fury broke, not ended, not passed, but paused, like a beast considering whether the meal was worth finishing. Above deck, the wind still blew, but it no longer howled. The sails flapped like breath catching in a cracked chest. The sea, still angry, still vast, relented just enough to allow balance. When the boy was allowed back up, the deck was slick, scattered with rope, broken crates, one torn sail flapping like a wound. Mare had a gash across his arm, Corlin's nose bled without pride, and Tubbs sat with his back against the mast, staring at nothing, muttering names the boy didn't recognize. The captain stood barefoot on the quarterdeck, his coat soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, one hand still on the wheel though the ship now drifted without guidance. He looked, for the first time, uncertain. The stars returned slowly that night, peeking through holes in the clouds like curious eyes. The boy, wrapped in a damp blanket that had once been a sail, lay beneath them and tried to make sense of their shapes. But they, too, seemed different now, rearranged by the storm, by motion, by something he couldn't name. And from below, the ship leaked. Not dangerously, not yet, but steadily, with a sound like someone sighing in their sleep. A slow, rhythmic confession that things had cracked, and though still afloat, they were no longer whole. Morning came slowly, as if uncertain whether it was welcome. The light crept across the deck like someone testing whether the room was still occupied, painting the ruined sail in streaks of gray and gold, illuminating barrels split along the grain, ropes frayed at the ends, and booths still soaked from the night before. No one spoke immediately. They moved with the quiet choreography of exhaustion, gathering fallen tools, testing rigging with fingers too numb for precision, pulling canvas down from where the wind had left it tangled like torn flags of a country they no longer served. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered, not in shouts or splinters, but in posture. The men stood slightly hunched, as if their bodies had not yet been told that the wind was gone, as if they expected the next gust to come from within. The wren, battered but afloat, moved sluggishly through a sea still restless. She no longer cut through water with purpose. She limped, nudged forward by habit and the faintest push of current. Her sails were patchwork upon patchwork now, stretched tight over spars that moaned with each shift of weight. Her mast leaned slightly, not enough to threaten collapse, but enough to change the sound of the wind against it, adding a whistle to the creak, a new note in the vessel's tired song. Below deck, the damage was less visible but more dangerous. Water had made its way in, not in floods, but in trickles, through seams strained beyond their patience. Buckets had been set in corners, bowls placed beneath drips, cloths stuffed into cracks with quiet hope. The smell of salt and damp rot was stronger now, blooming in the warm shadows where light never reached. The boy moved carefully among the crew, watching as they tried to restore what little control they had. He helped mend a torn line, his fingers stiff with cold, his palms blistered where the rope had slipped during the storm. No one praised him. No one had the breath for it. Corlin, one arm in a sling fashioned from a strip of sailcloth, muttered about proper storms, back in his younger days, though no one asked what had been proper about them. Mare had gone quiet again, his gaze distant, jaw working slowly as if chewing some memory he couldn't swallow. Tubb now walked with a limp, refusing to explain, but wincing each time the deck shifted beneath him. And the captain, still soaked, still unshaven, remained near the wheel, not to steer, but to look. He stared out over the water as if expecting the sea to apologize, or perhaps to confess. His hands were still, but the knuckles had turned white from gripping too long. They attempted repairs, but everything felt temporary. The sails patched, yes, but the thread pulled too tight. The ropes tied, but already fraying. Even the deck, dried by sun and silence, creaked with a reluctance that was no longer just structural. It was personal, almost resentful, as if the ship itself had grown weary of being tested. Meals were quieter now. The water, gathered from the last rains, had begun to turn. The bread was soft in the wrong way. The dried fish smelled less like food and more like memory. No one complained. Complaint required energy, and there was none to spare. The boy took to sleeping near the hold, where the leaks were worse, because he'd grown used to the sound of dripping. It was slow, steady, honest. It made no demands. He imagined it like a kind of heartbeat, the pulse of a ship trying to hold itself together, drip by patient drip. One night, he saw the captain writing again, not at the helm this time, but at the base of the mast, knees drawn up, journal open on one thigh, inkpot nestled in the crook of his elbow. His pen moved slowly, not like someone documenting facts, but like someone trying to pin down a thought that didn't want to be caught. The boy didn't ask what he was writing. He already knew it wouldn't be the truth, not the whole of it. Truth, at sea, was always too damp to take ink properly. 2 days after the storm, a small argument broke out over a barrel of salt pork. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. But it lingered longer than it should have, the kind of disagreement that comes from deeper places: fear, hunger, uncertainty. It ended with one man walking away with shaking fists, and another standing over the barrel with his back to the rest of the crew. No one spoke of it after, but the line between them had shifted, just slightly, just enough to notice when crossing it. The boy, lying awake one night, listening to the wood breathe and the men whisper in dreams, understood something new. Storms didn't end when the clouds passed. They ended much later, in quieter ways, in the way eyes stopped meeting, in how footsteps avoided certain parts of the deck, in how laughter, when it returned, sounded more like coughing. And the ship, still afloat, still traveling, leaked not just water now, but trust. And that, he thought, was harder to patch. Chapter 7. The Ink of Kings and the Blood of Sailors. It was Corlin who mentioned the letter again, not loud, not direct, just a passing comment made while coiling rope, his eyes on the knot, his voice flat and hollow. "Funny how quiet it's been," he said, "for a crew with royal paper on board." He didn't look up, and no one answered, but the words didn't vanish. They clung, the way dampness clings to canvas long after the rain has passed. The letter hadn't been seen in weeks. It still existed, everyone assumed, still tucked in its pouch, still safe in the captain's cabin or coat or wherever he kept it, but its presence had become abstract, a remembered myth rather than a working tool. Once, it had offered direction, legitimacy, a reason to move forward. Now, it sat like a question no one wanted answered, because the truth was beginning to sour. What they carried in the hold was not tribute, nor victory, nor even spoils well-earned. It was evidence of raids not approved, trades not declared, allegiances not loyal. The cargo no longer whispered of profit, it hummed with risk, and in that silence, suspicion fermented. The crew didn't argue, yet, but they paused more. In conversations. In eye contact. In choices about where to stand and who to stand beside. Trust, once spread thin but present, had begun to crack. Not loudly, but structurally, like a beam splitting deep within the wood. The boy watched it unfold the way one watches a storm gathering at the edge of the sea, not sudden, not surprising, but heavy with inevitability. He noticed how the crew glanced more often at the captain's cabin door. How they moved slower when he passed. How even Tub, once all cheer and grumble, now tied knots twice over, as if preparing for things to come undone. And the captain, he had changed, too. Not in posture, still as steady as a mast, and not in voice, still clipped and calm, but in his eyes, which no longer searched the horizon, but studied the faces around him with a care that felt less like leadership and more like calculation. One morning, as the boy swept water from the deck, he saw Mare standing near the helm, watching the captain write in that worn leather journal. When the captain turned, Mare did not look away. He held the gaze, just long enough, just steady enough, for a conversation to happen without words. Then he nodded, as if answering something silently asked, and walked away. That same night, a second voice mentioned the letter, this time below deck, this time sharper. "Might be worth seeing it again," someone said. "Just to remind ourselves who we're meant to be." It wasn't a demand. Not yet. But it wasn't a suggestion either. The boy, lying in his hammock with the sound of slow leaks and slow breathing around him, felt the shift more keenly than the creaking would. It wasn't rebellion. Not yet. But it was preparation, the mental stretching before a leap no one admitted planning. By the third day, the tension became tactile. It stuck to hands during meals. It tightened the space between shoulders during work. It hovered in the air between boots and planks, in the second longer pauses after orders were given, in the slight, persistent glance toward the hold. And the letter, still unseen, still unspoken, had become not a shield, but a wedge. Because if it truly existed, and if it truly gave them the authority they claimed, then why hadn't it been shown when the portmaster had raised an eyebrow? Why hadn't it been sighted when the second ship had been boarded? Why, if it meant so much, had it been hidden like contraband? The answers lay in the ink, of course. Ink that bore no signature familiar to any man aboard. Ink that, when read closely, allowed for action but promised no protection. Ink that had once felt noble, but now felt like the residue of someone else's plan, one they had stepped into with salt on their boots and hunger in their bellies. The boy wondered what would happen if the letter disappeared, if it fell overboard, or burned, or tore conveniently along the crease. Would they stop sailing? Would they turn themselves in? Would they feel free or exposed? He never asked. He never would. But he watched the others, especially the captain, and saw that he wasn't the only one thinking it. Then, one evening, as the sun bled into the sea and painted the sky with the kind of color no one trusted, a knock echoed on the captain's door, not hesitant, not polite. Firm. Final. And before it opened, the ship itself seemed to go still. The captain didn't rise when the door opened. He sat behind his desk, such as it was, a bolted plank stained with oil, candle wax, and age, his fingers resting lightly on the oilskin pouch, his eyes not yet lifted. The man who had knocked, Jellin, stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Behind him, Corlin lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, boots wide. Neither carried weapons in hand, but both carried them in posture. It was not a mutiny, not yet, but it no longer needed to be announced to be understood. "You've got the letter," Jellin said, voice low but without tremor, like someone repeating a line he had rehearsed in his mouth too many times. "Best we all see it again." The candle between them flickered once. The room smelled of salt, tallow, and something older, wood damp from below, leather turned soft from years of sweat. The boy, just outside the cabin, crouched beneath the open hatch, invisible and listening. He held his breath without meaning to. The captain said nothing for a long moment. His hand moved, slow, unhurried, drawing the pouch across the wood. He did not open it. He looked up instead. "When did trusts become so expensive?" he asked, his voice as dry as sand rubbed between boards. "We've had this paper since we left port. Since before the first tide. Since before that second ship. We've also had doubts," Corlin replied, stepping into the room now, letting the door shut behind him with a soft thud that sounded like something final. "And silence. And barrels below that don't match their markings." The pouch was opened. Inside, the letter remained intact, folded neatly, the parchment yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but still legible, the crest at the top sharp as a knife, a lion and anchor entwined, the symbol of a court that hadn't thought twice about the men it gave orders to. The captain placed it on the desk, flattening it gently, like a priest smoothing a burial shroud. Jellin stepped forward and read. Not aloud. Just with his eyes, one line at a time, his mouth twitching at certain phrases. Corlin did the same, leaning over, the candlelight warping the shadows on his face. When they finished, Heather spoke. Because the truth was worse than a lie, it was a half-truth. The document, for all its formality and ribboned edges, said nothing specific. It granted freedom of movement, in contested waters, permission to intercept hostile cargo, and promised indemnity under appropriate circumstances. But it named no enemy. It named no captain. And it certainly didn't give them license to raid merchants that happened to look the other way. The letter wasn't forged. That was the worst of it. It was real. But it had been written by a man far from the sea, in a city where maps were drawn with ink but not consequence, a man who would never be there when a blade was drawn or when a cannon misfired or when blood spilled quietly onto deck boards at dawn. What does it mean? Jellin finally asked, not to anyone in particular, but because someone had to. The captain didn't answer. Because it meant everything. And nothing.it meant they had been used.it meant they had become something no one wanted to name. And it meant that the ink which once offered protection now only served to bind them together, not by loyalty, but by shared liability. Corlin stepped back from the table. So when they come, he said, because of course they would come. What do we say? That we thought we had permission? The captain folded the letter slower this time, as if trying to make it smaller than it was. We say, he replied, that we were at sea. And maybe that would be enough, but no one believed it. Later that night, while the ship creaked quietly and the waves slapped softly against her sides, the boy watched Jellin toss something overboard. He couldn't see what it was. It made no sound when it hit the water. No splash. No ripple. But in the morning, the letter was gone, not spoken of, not asked for, just gone, and no one looked surprised. Because sometimes, the blood of sailors isn't spilled in battle. Sometimes, it dries in silence, sealed in folds of parchment, stamped with a seal that never cared where the ink came from. Chapter 8. The Islands That Shouldn't Be Mapped. They saw it first as a blur through mist. Low hills rising out of the sea like thoughts left half-formed, their edges soft, their colors muted. No sails greeted them, no birds circled overhead, no smoke curled from the treetops. It was not the kind of land sailors look for, but the kind that finds them when the wind forgets where else to go. No one said the word island? Not at first. They watched in silence as it took shape, as the water around it grew greener, slower, almost thick. The air tasted different here, not salty, not sweet, but rich, like soil after heavy rain. The sky above it wasn't stormy, but it wasn't calm either. It had the color of a bruise healing wrong. The wren approached slowly, reluctantly, her hull groaning with every wave, as though protesting this arrival. The crew didn't cheer, didn't prepare a landing party, didn't tighten their gear in anticipation of trade or resupply. They simply stood, hands on ropes, eyes narrowed, unsure whether to hope or to turn. The island had no name, at least, none they knew, and it offered no harbor, just a soft slope of sand spilling out into the water, fringed by trees too tall, too narrow, their leaves the wrong shade of green. Behind them, the land rose in slow folds, draped in vines and shadows. There was a stillness to it. Not peace. Something closer to waiting. They dropped anchor in shallow water and lowered a rowboat, not as a team, not in formation, just enough men to seem confident, not enough to commit. The boy went too. Not because he was asked, but because no one stopped him. He sat in the boat beside Mare, who had not spoken in 2 days, and Jellin, whose hand never strayed far from the blade tucked at his hip. The oars dipped quietly, rhythmically, as if afraid to disturb the silence. The water, too clear for comfort, showed stones beneath shaped like bones, not human, not animal, but organic somehow, as if grown rather than fallen. They reached the shore without resistance. The sand was soft, unnaturally so, like flour sifted too fine, and it clung to their boots, their cuffs, their skin. It smelled faintly of ash. No wind moved here. The trees loomed ahead, still and silent, branches reaching upward like arms locked in a prayer too long unanswered. They entered slowly, weapons low, eyes wide, not searching for threat, but for understanding. There were no paths, no birds, no insects. Just sound, the sound of breath, of boots against root, of wood creaking in the distance where no wind blew. They found the first structure before they found any signs of life. It wasn't a building, not exactly, but something shaped, a ring of stones too deliberate to be natural, too ancient to be recent. Moss clung to it in patches. In its center, a bowl carved from black rock held water that did not ripple, even when touched. The boy leaned close and saw his own reflection, but it was wrong, older, perhaps, or just more tired than he remembered. He blinked, looked again, and it was gone. They said nothing. Not about the ring. Not about the water. Not about the fact that the island felt less like a place and more like a memory someone else had left behind. Deeper in, they found more shapes, objects that might have been altars, or grinding stones, or markers for things buried too deep to name. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling of being watched grew heavier. They turned back before dusk, not from fear, not quite, but because the light had begun to change in ways they couldn't explain. It didn't dim. It shifted, casting shadows where none had been, making trees look taller, angles sharper, time slower. Back at the shore, the tide hadn't moved. The boat was still where they'd left it, the anchor line still taut, the sea as still as glass. But the wren looked different now, smaller, darker, farther away than it should have been. They returned silently. No1 asked what they'd found. No1 admitted they hadn't found anything. But that night, no one slept. The stars above the island were unfamiliar, more numerous, brighter, clustered into shapes no sailor recognized. Constellations that looked like knots, like eyes, like open mouths. And the next morning, the boy awoke to find footprints in the sand beside the boat. Not theirs. Bare, small, pointed inward. They returned at first light, not because they wanted to, but because they could not bear not to. The footprints had done what words could not, they called them back. Small, perfect, fresh despite the night. They led nowhere. They came from nothing. But they existed, and that was enough. The air was thicker this time. Not hotter, not colder, just more. It pressed against their skin like a damp blanket, and each breath tasted faintly of stone. The trees did not rustle, but somehow the forest seemed louder, filled with the kind of silence that amplifies heartbeat and thought. They brought more men this time, not out of confidence, but out of superstition, the logic that more boots on the ground meant more chances someone else would be the one to stumble on what shouldn't be seen. The boy came too, again uninvited, again unchallenged. No one led. They simply moved. The island did not resist, but it did not welcome. The ground held their weight as though it remembered them. The branches parted just enough to let them pass, and the light filtered down through leaves that no longer looked quite green. The smell had changed too. Less of soil now, more of parchment, dried blood, old breath. They passed the stone ring again. It hadn't changed. Or perhaps it had. The moss was darker. The water in the bowl, when touched, now felt warm. And no one looked into it twice. They ventured deeper, and the signs grew stranger. A wall, half buried in vine, its stones shaped by hands, fitted too cleanly to be nature's work, yet worn too smooth to be recent. Symbols carved into it, not letters, not images, marks that made the eye shift and the brain resist. The kind of shapes that left impressions but no memory. One man, Jellin, touched them with bare fingers, then stepped back quickly, as if burned, though his skin showed no change. He said nothing. But he did not smile again that day. They found no people. But they found traces, tools abandoned in neat piles, not rusted, not rotted. A cup set on a stone table, still holding a thin layer of water. A scrap of cloth pinned beneath a pebble, its edges frayed not by time, but by something more deliberate. Everything looked like it had just been left. Everything looked like no one had ever lived there at all. By midday, some of the men wanted to turn back. Not from fear, because fear can be named, and what they felt had no name. It was closer to dissonance, like hearing a sound that didn't match its source, or seeing a reflection that blinks before you do. Still, they went deeper. They found a clearing near the island's heart. In its center stood a single stone pillar, taller than a man, cracked down one side. It bore no markings. No vines climbed it. Nothing grew too near. It stood untouched, as if the world itself had decided to leave it alone. The boy stepped toward it, slowly, without being told that he didn't touch it. He only stood near it, listening. Not for sound, but for feeling, and what he felt was absence, not silence, not peace, but the sense that something had once been there and had been taken, not long ago, not forcefully, just quietly. Like a word forgotten mid-sentence. Like a fire that went out without smoke. The others watched him, but didn't approach. Even the captain, who had come this time, stopped several paces away. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, not out of threat, but for grounding. As though the weapon reminded him he was still part of something real. They stayed only minutes, and then they turned. not because they had found anything they understood, but because the island had given all it would. Not truth. Not treasure. Just itself. That night, they didn't speak of what they'd seen, but they sat closer on the deck. They shared food without asking. They slept in shallower breaths. The stars above the island were different again. Fewer now. Or perhaps only dimmer. The boy awoke before dawn and walked to the stern, where the sea met the sky with no seam. He looked back toward the island, now just a dark hump on the horizon, its outline soft with distance. And for the first time since leaving the village, since stepping aboard the Wren, since the first storm and the first raid and the first lie, he did not wonder what came next. He only wondered what they had left behind, and whether it had ever been theirs to begin with. Chapter 9. The gallows are for the unlucky. It didn't begin with shouting, nor with a blade drawn in rage, nor with a splash in the night, though all of those would eventually follow. It began, as most endings do, with something quieter, a look held too long, a sentence left unfinished, a task repeated without being asked. No one announced mistrust. It settled like moisture, first invisible, then undeniable, until the walls themselves began to warp beneath it. The barrel of salted fish was the first sign. When opened, it yielded only brine, 2 rotted scraps of cloth, and the faint, sour memory of something that might once have been edible. No thief confessed. No accusation followed. But the silence that crept in afterward changed the way men sat during meals. Pairs replaced groups. Conversations shortened to grunts. And no one, not even the boy, left a bowl unattended. Then came the rudder chain. Not torn. Not smashed. Just ground thin. Worn to the edge of function, the links barely holding their own shape. The captain examined it without a word, his jaw working slowly, not in anger, but in calculation. He gave the order to repair it with a voice that had once been crisp, but now carried something heavier than command, something that felt like disappointment sharpened into precision. The ship itself had begun to creak differently. Not louder, but deeper. The kind of groaning that meant stress was not just in the wood, but in the joints between men, in the conversations no longer had, in the stories left half-told for fear they might point fingers. The boy, who still worked the quiet corners of the ship, oiling hinges, coiling ropes that no one asked to be coiled, watched the change with the kind of quiet attention that belongs only to those who know they are small and therefore overlooked. He noticed how Mare now sat with his back to the wall, how Corlin polished a blade he hadn't used in weeks, and how Jowlin stopped writing in the logbook 3 days after Tubb had died. Tubb had died in his hammock, one arm across his chest, the other limp beside the mug he'd used for 3 voyages. There had been no illness, no complaint. He had simply gone still. They buried him in the sea without ceremony. The captain muttered, "He was a good sailor." And that was all. No one added more. Perhaps there was nothing to add. After that laughter, what little had remained, vanished like breath in fog. The crew worked in silence, slept in fragments, and kept knives close, not because they expected battle, but because empty hands now felt unsafe. The captain remained at the helm, but his grip on the ship, both literally and otherwise, had loosened. He no longer paced the deck at night. He no longer shared bread. His coat, once clean despite the salt, now bore stains along the seams, and then, of course, there was the ship on the horizon. It appeared one morning, flat and clean against the line where sky and sea made their uneasy agreement. A vessel not like theirs, fresh sails, full masts, crisp hull lines that spoke of funding, of discipline, of purpose. A ship that had come from land and law, not from drifting. No one needed to say what it was. A patrol. A witness. A reckoning. The crew gathered slowly, without order, without a bell, without the need to pretend it was routine. They looked at the sails, now rising fast across the water, then at each other, not in accusation, but in acknowledgement. Whatever they had been, whatever they had claimed, was about to be examined by eyes that would not care for stories. The boy stood beside the mast, gripping a coil of line that no longer needed organizing. He looked at the captain, whose face held no expression now, only stillness, a stillness so complete it felt like waiting for a verdict already known. Corlin, arms folded, said simply, "They're close enough to see." No one argued. No one prepared the cannon. No one fetched the signal flags. And the letter, the royal parchment that had once fluttered between legality and excuse, was still missing. Or rather, still unmentioned. The ship grew larger. Faces became visible on its deck. Voices faintly drifted across the water, not shouted, but projected with the confidence of authority. Orders given cleanly. Lines drawn. Intentions declared through sails and silence. "They'll ask for names," Mayor said. "And answers. And they'll get stories," Corlin muttered. "And see through every one of them." The captain finally moved. He stepped away from the wheel, walked the length of the deck with the deliberate pace of someone weighing his own shadow, then reached into his coat and pulled out something small and wrinkled. It had been folded too long. The seal, once proud and wax-red, had faded to the color of old blood. The edge was charred. The bottom corner missing. The letter had returned, but it did not rescue. He held it out, not aloft, not defiantly, just offered. Then let it fall to the deck, where it landed near the boy's foot, flopped once in the wind, and came to rest like a dead fish. And no one picked it up. The patrol ship was now within hailing distance. A voice rang out across the water. "State your name. And your purpose." No one replied. The captain looked to the sails, to the sky, to the crew. Then, slowly, he raised a hand, not in surrender, not quite, but in reply. His fingers did not tremble, but the wind seemed to. The gallows, the boy thought, were never meant for justice. They were built for conclusion, and conclusion, like truth, always arrives late. The patrol ship pulled alongside with the quiet precision of something used to being obeyed. Her sails furled in clean arcs, her ropes moved without creak or complaint, and her hull, smooth and freshly caulked, glided across the water like authority itself, silent, gleaming, and very much awake. From the deck of the Wren, everything looked too clean. Their own vessel, once functional if not noble, now seemed stained in every sense. Canvas faded to the color of stale butter, timbers worn and speaking in groans, the seams of the ship showing their fatigue in every knot that had been retied too many times. And the men aboard her, weathered by salt and silence, looked smaller now, not just in posture, but in purpose. The patrol's officers stood in rows, coats crisp, eyes narrowed not in malice, but in expectation. These were not men hunting pirates. These were men recording infractions. There was no emotion in their gaze, no drama. Just the burden of confirming what was already suspected. A plank was extended, not offered with ceremony, but placed matter-of-factly, as one might slide a tray across a table. One officer crossed first, his boots thudding softly against the Wren's deck, the sound strangely loud in the hush. He was older than expected, with a face that seemed carved rather than aged, lines sharp and deep, and eyes that did not wander. He didn't ask questions immediately. He simply looked. Looked at the sails, at the ropework, at the crates in the hold, at the stains along the rail that no one had bothered to scrub clean. The crew stood scattered, not in resistance, but in a posture that said, "Yes, we know." The boy stayed near the mast, eyes fixed on the man's every movement, though the man never once glanced his way. Children weren't worth questioning at sea. They didn't write orders. They didn't sign letters. They only watched. Eventually, the officer turned toward the captain, who hadn't moved since lowering the letter to the deck. The paper still rested where it had fallen, curled slightly at the corners, darkened with water, stamped with a seal that no longer bore weight. The officer didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. "Your name," he said, not with challenge, but as if checking the next box in a long list of boxes that had been filled many times before. The captain answered, "Just the name. No embellishment, no rank, no attempt to invoke the crown or its interests." "And the name of this vessel?" "The Wren," he said, and his voice didn't crack, but it didn't carry far either. The officer's eyes shifted once, just once, to the boy, then returned to the captain. "Manifest?" A pause. Then, with a kind of gentle defeat, the captain motioned to the crates lashed along the deck, to the barrels covered in old tarps, to the hold that smelled of spice and salt and a lie long since spoiled. The officer did not ask for the letter. Perhaps because he had already read hundreds like it. Perhaps because he had already buried dozens of men who had carried similar ones. Perhaps because he knew that at sea, paper weighed less than truth. Without another word, the officer turned and crossed back to his ship. The gangplank was withdrawn with the same mechanical grace it had been laid down, and the patrol vessel did not fire, did not bind anyone in rope, did not shout accusations across the deck. It simply remained beside them for a time, visible, present, inescapable. Then, when the sun had shifted just slightly, and the wind had turned back toward land, it peeled away and sailed on, its sails catching the light like nothing had ever happened. The Wren did not follow. No one spoke until night, and even then, the words were few. The boy found the letter still lying near his feet. It was damp, the ink beginning to feather at the edges, the parchment soft to the touch like cloth left too long in seawater. He picked it up, folded it slowly, and tucked it into his coat, not to protect it, not to use it, just to carry the shape of what it once meant. Above, the stars had returned. The same stars that had always been there, but tonight they looked different. Or maybe the boy had simply stopped expecting them to guide anything. Because in the end, gallows aren't built from wood. They're built from silence, and delay, and papers that mean something only when someone else believes they do, and when they come. If they come, they don't look like nooses. They look like sails, white and clean, drifting away after everything has already been decided. Chapter 10, The Scent of Home, or something like it. Not strong, not immediate, just a faint trace of something other than salt and rope and the mildew of weeks spent afloat. It came on the breeze at dawn, subtle as breath, and carried the ghost of something leafy, something dry, something that had once grown in still earth rather than shifting water. The boy was the first to notice, standing at the rail before anyone else stirred, his eyes closed, his fingers curled around the frayed edge of the hull. He didn't say anything, but when he inhaled, he did so deeply, as if reminding his body what it meant to remember. By midday, they saw it, a low coastline, more suggestion than certainty, its colors muted by mist and distance. No towers. No flags. Just trees, short and wind-bent, and beyond them, a gentle rise of hills whose slopes looked familiar in the way all coastlines eventually do, distant cousins to places once called home. The Wren did not cheer. No one clapped shoulders or called out. They simply watched, each man keeping his thoughts behind his eyes, too tired for optimism, too tangled for regret. They didn't know what port this was. The maps had long since gone soft with moisture, and the stars, while faithful, had offered no answers to the kinds of questions the crew had begun to ask in silence. But they turned toward the land regardless, not because it was safe, or welcoming, but because it was there, a place to stop, at last, and possibly pretend to begin again. The sails moved reluctantly, heavy with the memory of all they had carried, and the rudder creaked with the voice of wood that no longer wanted to decide direction. The ship's shadow trailed behind like an apology. They approached without ceremony, just a worn ship gliding across quiet water, her figure leaning ever so slightly to one side, as though even she, after everything, wanted to rest. The dock was small. Weathered. Empty. No guards. No merchants. No flags. Just a long stretch of warped timber, its boards grayed by time, some cracked, some soft, all shaped by the rhythm of waves far older than any man on board. They tied off lines with care but no urgency. Ropes fell into place like habits, not duty, and then, for the first time in months, they stepped off the ship. The boy was among the last to go. He waited until the others had disembarked, not to avoid them, but because he wanted to hear the Wren's sigh, to feel her shift beneath his boots one final time. When he did step off, the dock felt strange beneath him, too still, too wide, too dry. His legs remembered the roll of the sea more than the firmness of land. He swayed, just slightly, but did not stumble. They didn't speak. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't lie. They simply walked. The path beyond the dock was unmarked. It wound between low trees and grass flattened by time, and the only sound was the creak of boots and the distant cry of some bird that didn't care who they were or what they had done. The town, if it could be called that, revealed itself slowly. A few cottages, a shuttered tavern, the hint of smoke curling from a chimney that someone had remembered to tend. There were no guards, no gallows, no clerks with ledgers waiting to count barrels or question intentions. Just people, ordinary people, dressed plainly, moving between buildings, pausing only briefly as the crew passed. There were no shouts no whispers, only recognition. Not of names or crimes or loyalties, but of the simple, worn look of men who had spent too long away from the weight of steady earth, and that was enough. The crew began to scatter, one to the tavern, another to a door with peeling paint, a third to sit on a bench and stare at nothing in particular. They said no goodbyes. They carried no banners. They had left behind whatever could not survive landfall. The boy didn't follow any of them. He walked until he found a low wall of stone, half collapsed, half forgotten, overlooking a field that smelled of grass and dry wood and old seasons. He sat there, pulling his knees up, resting his chin on them. He could still feel the ship in his bones, still feel the salt in his throat. And in his coat, still folded and now nearly unreadable, was the letter. He pulled it out slowly, opened it carefully. The ink had run. The paper had softened. But the seal still clung to the corner, stubborn and red. He didn't read it. He didn't have to. He'd already read it with every day that had passed since the sails first caught wind. He let it rest on the stone beside him, where the breeze caught it and moved it gently, like a thing no longer needed but not yet willing to vanish. And for the first time, he let himself imagine what it might mean to stay, not as a sailor, not as a pirate, not even as a boy who had once watched stars to understand who he might become, but simply someone sitting still. And in the distance, beyond the trees, the wind rustled a flag on a pole that had long since lost its paint. He didn't look back, because whatever the Wren had been, whatever they had all become, the sea had taken enough. And here, finally, was a place where the air no longer smelled of dead, only of wood and grass. And maybe, if he breathed slowly enough, of something close to home. The days that followed were unremarkable in the way healing often is, quiet, slow, and full of things too ordinary to notice until they stop hurting. The boy found work mending nets near the harbor, not because he was asked, but because his hands already knew how rope should move, and someone had left a pile of tangled twine in the sun. No one questioned him. No one asked where he had come from. He simply began, and so he belonged. The others vanished by degrees. Jellin took a post in the harbor office, logging incoming vessels with the kind of irony that didn't need to be said aloud. Mayer, who had once stared at the sea like it owed him something, now sat outside the tavern most afternoons, his eyes no longer searching the horizon but watching the street, like someone finally content to count what passed instead of chasing what didn't. Corlin stayed longest aboard the Wren, sleeping below deck for 3 nights after landfall, as if waiting for the ship to protest. When she didn't, he disembarked quietly, and no one saw where he went next. The Wren herself remained at dock. Untouched, untended, not forgotten, exactly, but left. Her sails were lowered. Her name still visible, though weathered into a question. The town made no move to claim her. The crew didn't speak of selling her, or repairing her, or sailing again. She simply stayed there, moored more by memory than by rope, her planks still bearing the dust of islands unnamed and winds unkind. The boy visited her once, just once. He stepped aboard, walked her length slowly, placing his palm against the mainmast, feeling the faint heat still caught in the wood. He listened to her groan under his step, not in complaint, but in recognition. He did not linger. He did not cry. He only walked to the stern, stood a while, and then stepped back onto the dock for the final time. The letter never reappeared. Whether it had blown away, been buried, or simply dissolved into the folds of time, no one could say. It had done what it was always meant to do, not protect, not prove, but pass, and that was enough. Months went by, marked only by shifts in the wind and the way the sun hit the same corners of the buildings a little differently each week. The town did not grow. It did not change. But the boy did. Slowly, not in height or strength, but in stillness. He no longer flinched when birds flew too close. He no longer stared too long at the sea. He began to dream of things not shaped like sails, and in those dreams, he was never running. Sometimes he visited the field beyond the stone wall, where grass bent easily and wind moved gently without the sound of rigging behind it. He brought no tools, no journal, only himself. Once he found a feather there, long, dark, striped with silver. He did not take it. He left it where it lay, because not everything found must be carried, and not every journey needs a map to count as a return.